The 10-year-old stood in the August sun outside the cotton gin, his bare feet planted in red clay dust, and spoke 3 sentences that made every adult within hearing distance go silent. He named the overseer's hidden bank account in Natchez. He named the 3 children sold south without the master's knowledge. He named the woman found drowned in the creek last April. Within 18 days, Thomas Wexler, overseer of Bellmont plantation in Adams County, Mississippi, would be dead. His face twisted in a final expression witnesses described as recognition and terror. The enslaved community would whisper one word: curse. The white establishment would write natural causes, but the truth lived somewhere between folklore and ledger ink, in the space where a child's impossible knowledge collided with a man's carefully buried sins, and the weight of secrets became fatal. Bellmont plantation sat on 1,200 acres of Mississippi bottomland, where the soil ran black and the mosquitoes bred thick as smoke. The main house rose 3 stories, white columns holding up a facade that spoke of cotton wealth and old Virginia bloodlines, though neither was quite as solid as they appeared. Colonel Marcus Bellmont had inherited the property from his father in 1841, along with 63 enslaved people and debts that gnawed at the estate's margins like weevils in stored grain. By 1856, the year Isaac Brown turned 10, Bellmont had thinned his workforce to 42 souls through strategic sales and what he called natural attrition. He spent most of his time in Natchez, attending to state legislature business and avoiding the daily mechanics of plantation management. That work fell to Thomas Wexler. Wexler had arrived from Georgia in 1849, carrying references from 3 plantations and a reputation for making numbers work. He was 36 years old, built lean and hard, with pale blue eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they touched. He kept his own cottage near the overseer's office, a brick building set between the main house and the quarters where he maintained the plantation's records, stored equipment, and conducted the business of converting human labor into profit. The enslaved community at Bellmont learned quickly that Wexler was different from overseers who ruled through spectacle and rage. He was methodical. He documented everything. He punished through deprivation rather than the lash. Reduced rations, withheld passes to visit family on neighboring plantations, assignment to the worst tasks in the hottest weather. He kept people off balance through unpredictability, through the sense that he was always watching, always remembering, always 3 moves ahead. But there were gaps in his surveillance, spaces where he couldn't see. Isaac Brown was one of those spaces. Isaac had been born on Bellmont in the spring of 1846, the 3rd child of Sarah and Matthew Brown. His father worked the fields. His mother worked in the main house, cooking, cleaning, managing the daily operations that kept the Bellmont family fed and comfortable. Sarah was 42 years old, a woman whose hands never stopped moving and whose eyes revealed nothing. Isaac was small for his age, which made him useful for certain tasks. He could climb into tight spaces to retrieve dropped tools or clear jammed equipment. He could slip through crowds without being noticed. By the time he was 8, he'd been assigned to help his mother in the main house, where he learned to move through rooms as if he were part of the furniture. The main house staff consisted of 5 people. Sarah managed them all. Her own 2 daughters, ages 14 and 16, who did the washing and heavy cleaning. An elderly man named Joseph, who maintained the fires and carried water. And Isaac, who ran errands, cleaned boots, and performed whatever small tasks required hands too young to be doing field labor, but old enough to be useful. Colonel Bellmont rarely paid attention to Isaac. The boy was simply there, like the silver service or the hunting dogs. But Isaac paid attention to everything. He noticed which books the colonel left open on his desk. He noticed when mail arrived and when it was answered. He noticed the rhythm of the household, who visited, when money changed hands, which conversations happened behind closed doors. And he noticed when things went missing. Small things at first. A silver snuff box that disappeared from the colonel's study in April of 1855. A gold watch chain that vanished during the fall harvest. 3 bottles of French brandy that should have lasted through Christmas but were empty by October. The colonel blamed the house staff, conducted searches of the quarters, and threatened punishment. But nothing was ever found because no one in the quarters had taken them. Isaac knew this because he'd seen Wexler leaving the main house late at night on 3 separate occasions, carrying items wrapped in cloth. He'd said nothing because enslaved children who spoke out of turn rarely lived to repeat the mistake. But he'd remembered. He remembered everything. The summer of 1856 arrived early and stayed late, pressing down on Adams County like a physical weight. By early August, the cotton plants stood waist-high, their bowls beginning to open under a sun that seemed to have forgotten the concept of mercy. The overseer's bell rang at 4:30 each morning, calling the field hands to work that wouldn't end until the light failed 14 hours later. It was during this season that 3 things happened in rapid succession, each one tightening the spiral that would end with Thomas Wexler's death. First, on August 4th, a young woman named Margaret disappeared from Bellmont plantation. She was 17 years old, the daughter of 2 field workers, and pregnant with her first child. She'd been assigned to lighter duties, working in the vegetable garden rather than the cotton rows. But on the morning of August 4th, she simply wasn't at muster. Wexler organized a search. They found her body in Indian Creek 3 miles downstream 2 days later. The official determination was accidental drowning, despite the fact that Margaret had grown up swimming in that creek and knew every current and sandbar. Second, on August 9th, a field hand named Samuel tried to run. He made it 23 miles before the dogs caught him near Kingston. Wexler brought him back tied to a horse, paraded him through the quarters as an example, and then sold him to a slave trader heading to the sugar plantations in Louisiana. A fate everyone understood was slower than hanging, but just as final. Samuel's wife and 2 children remained at Bellmont. They were not permitted to say goodbye. Third, on August 15th, Colonel Bellmont arrived unexpectedly from Natchez, bringing with him an accountant from his bank. They spent 3 days in the overseer's office, going through ledgers with Wexler standing by, his face carefully neutral. Something in the numbers wasn't adding up. The colonel had received reports that Bellmont's crop yields were improving, but the corresponding profit wasn't appearing in his accounts. Someone was taking money, and the colonel intended to find out who. Isaac heard all of this because he was there. His mother had been called to the office to bring coffee and food during the long review sessions. Isaac carried the trays, refilled the cups, and stood quietly in corners while men discussed numbers that represented human lives reduced to columns of debit and credit. And he saw something the others missed. A single page, tucked hastily under a stack of supply orders when the colonel stepped out of the office. On it, in Wexler's precise handwriting, were 3 names: Margaret, Samuel, and a third name Isaac recognized, a young man who'd been sold off plantation the previous winter, supposedly to settle a debt. Next to each name was a dollar amount. Next to Samuel's name, the notation: N.O. Trader, August 9, delivered, payment received. The overseer wasn't just managing the plantation. He was running a private commerce in human flesh, skimming from the colonel's property and pocketing the difference. Isaac didn't tell his mother what he'd seen. He didn't tell his father. He was 10 years old, and the calculus of survival was already written into his bones. Enslaved children who spoke about things they'd witnessed in the main house ended up in the fields, or worse. Sarah had taught her children to see nothing, hear nothing, remember nothing that could bring trouble to their family. But Isaac couldn't stop seeing it. That page, those names, those dollar amounts. He began paying attention differently, not just watching, but recording. He had no paper of his own, no way to write down what he learned. Instead, he built a mental ledger, storing facts the way his mother stored recipes, through repetition and pattern, until they became part of his permanent memory. He noticed that Wexler took trips to Natchez twice monthly, always overnight, always returning with goods supposedly purchased for plantation use. But some of those goods never appeared in the storerooms. Isaac checked, because one of his tasks was helping Joseph inventory supplies. Blankets would be listed as delivered, but never distributed. Tools would appear on purchase orders, but never make it to the blacksmith's shop. He noticed that Wexler had relationships with 3 traders who passed through the area regularly. Men who dealt in what they called surplus property. Enslaved people being moved from failing plantations to more profitable ventures further south. These men would arrive at Bellmont with wagons, meet with Wexler in his office, and depart with 1 or 2 people who'd been pulled from the fields that very morning. The colonel was often away during these transactions, trusting his overseer to handle minor sales as the estate's needs dictated. But the people being sold weren't the weak or the troublesome. The ones an overseer might legitimately remove to maintain productivity. They were the young, the strong, the ones with children who'd have no choice but to stay behind and keep working. They were people whose absence would hurt their families enough to keep everyone else in line through grief and fear, but whose labor could be replaced during the next hiring season. Wexler was farming the enslaved community itself, harvesting human capital and converting it to private wealth. Isaac also noticed who else must have known. The colonel's accountant had spent 3 days reviewing ledgers. Surely he'd seen discrepancies. But when he departed, no accusations were made. The local slave traders who participated in Wexler's scheme knew they were buying property that belonged to Colonel Bellmont, not to his overseer. But the sales continued. Even some of the other enslaved people at Bellmont must have suspected something, must have noticed the pattern of who got sold and when. But everyone stayed silent because the system ran on silence. Because speaking up required believing your voice mattered more than your survival. Because the entire structure of plantation society was built on the assumption that the powerful would never be held accountable by those they held in bondage. Isaac was about to test that assumption. The mechanics of Wexler's scheme were brutally simple once you understood them. Adams County sat at the intersection of several major slave trading routes: the Mississippi River to the west, the Natchez Trace running north-south, and the network of roads connecting to Mobile and New Orleans. Traders moved through the area constantly, dealing in what they euphemistically called labor redistribution. Wexler had positioned himself as a useful contact for these traders. He knew which plantations were struggling, which owners were desperate for cash, which families could be split without causing immediate rebellion. He also controlled access to Colonel Bellmont's property and the authority to make minor sales without requiring the colonel's personal approval, a privilege Bellmont had granted his overseer as a time-saving convenience, never imagining it would be abused. The scheme worked like this. Wexler would identify someone from Bellmont's workforce, usually someone young enough to fetch a high price, old enough to survive the journey south, and connected enough to other people on the plantation that their removal would send a message about compliance. He'd create a paper trail showing they'd been sold to cover estate debts or operational costs. Then he'd contact one of his trader partners, arrange the sale privately, and pocket the difference between the fabricated official price and the actual market rate. The traders got reliable inventory. Wexler got cash that never appeared in Colonel Bellmont's ledgers. The colonel's accountant got paid to notice discrepancies, but not investigate them too thoroughly. A common arrangement in a world where overseers and accountants often had more in common with each other than with the aristocrats they served. From the Natchez Daily Courier, July 3, 1856. The market for prime hands remains strong, with reports of several private sales conducted through trusted intermediaries in the county. Planters seeking to maintain discretion in workforce adjustments continue to find willing partners among the established trading firms. Translation: the system existed in plain sight, documented in newspapers and courthouse records, and nobody questioned it because enslaved people were property, and property could be moved, sold, and manipulated at the owner's discretion. The fact that overseers might exploit this system for personal gain was understood, but rarely prosecuted, because doing so would require acknowledging the humanity of the people being stolen. But Margaret's death had been different. She hadn't been sold. She'd been killed. Margaret's mother was named Dinah. She was 43 years old, had been born on Bellmont plantation, and had buried 2 children before Margaret, one to fever, one to a farm accident that wasn't entirely accidental. When her daughter's body was pulled from Indian Creek on August 6th, Dinah had stood silent while Wexler explained to Colonel Bellmont that the girl must have slipped on the bank while washing clothes, hit her head on a rock, and drowned before anyone could help her. The story was plausible enough. Accidents happened. Enslaved people died from overwork, disease, violence, and misadventure at rates that rarely troubled official records. Margaret's death would be noted in the Plantation Journal. August 6, 1856, Margaret, property of Monsieur Bellmont, deceased by drowning. But Dinah knew her daughter hadn't been washing clothes at Indian Creek. Margaret had been assigned to the vegetable garden that morning, working close to the main house where her pregnancy would allow her lighter duties. Someone had taken her away from that assignment. Someone had walked her or carried her 3 miles downstream, and someone had held her under the water until she stopped struggling. 2 other people knew this because they'd seen Margaret being led toward the creek path by Wexler himself on the afternoon of August 4th. They'd said nothing because enslaved people who testified against white overseers ended up dead, sold, or worse. Silence was survival. Speech was suicide. But now Isaac was asking questions. He'd come to Dinah 3 days after Margaret's burial, found her alone in the spinning house where she worked fiber into thread for the plantation's weaving operation. He'd stood in the doorway, this small 10-year-old, and said, "I saw the ledger page. I know she was going to be sold. I know he killed her because he couldn't sell a pregnant woman and explain the missing inventory." Dinah had stared at him, her hands frozen on the spinning wheel. Then she'd said, "You need to forget what you saw. You need to be quiet and live. How many more people does he get to kill before someone says something? He gets to kill all of us if that's what it takes. That's how the world works. You're old enough to know that." But Isaac had kept pushing. Over the following week, he'd approached 4 other people, adults who worked in positions where they might have seen things, noticed patterns, understood pieces of Wexler's operation. Each conversation was brief, careful, and terrifying for the adults involved. A child was asking them to confirm what they'd witnessed. A child was building a case. A child was preparing to speak. And one by one, they'd told him. Yes, Margaret was going to be sold. Yes, Wexler had his own bank account in Natchez, where he deposited money from private sales. Yes, Samuel had fetched a higher price than what appeared in the official records. Yes, there were at least 3 other people sold over the past 2 years, whose proceeds never reached Colonel Bellmont's accounts. The cotton gin stood at the plantation's northern edge, a large wooden structure where harvested bolls would be processed to separate fiber from seed. In mid-August, before the main harvest began, the gin house served as a gathering point for equipment maintenance and workforce assignments. Wexler held his weekly muster there each Saturday morning, reviewing the coming week's labor distribution with the drivers and key field hands. August 18th was a Saturday. 27 people had assembled at the gin house by 7 o'clock in the morning. The 6 drivers who supervised field crews, the blacksmith, the carpenter, 2 men who managed the livestock, and 17 others whose work required coordination with the overseer's planning. Sarah was there because she needed approval to slaughter chickens for the main house. Isaac was there because he'd carried his mother's request book. Wexler stood on the gin house steps, elevated above the assembled workers, working through his weekly list with the mechanical efficiency that characterized everything he did. He'd just finished explaining a schedule change for the coming week when Isaac stepped forward from where he'd been standing beside his mother. "Mr. Wexler, I need to ask you something." The overseer looked down at the child with the same expression he'd use for an insect on his boot. Minor irritation at an interruption that would be quickly resolved. "You don't ask questions, boy. You wait until you're spoken to. Where's the money from when you sold Samuel?" The gin house went silent. 27 people stopped breathing. Sarah's hand shot out to grab Isaac's shoulder, but he'd already committed. Samuel was sold August 9th for $400 to the trader from New Orleans. But Colonel Bellmont's ledger shows $275. Where's the other $125? Wexler's face went carefully neutral. "Get that child away from here before he says something that gets him hurt." Isaac didn't move. And Margaret wasn't supposed to drown. She was supposed to be sold. But you couldn't sell a pregnant woman without questions, so you killed her instead. You walked her down to Indian Creek on August 4th around 2 in the afternoon, and you held her under until she stopped moving. Time seemed to suspend. The horror wasn't just that Isaac had said these things. The horror was that everyone present knew they were true, had known pieces of it, and had stayed silent because slaves didn't accuse overseers of theft and murder. Not if they wanted to live. Wexler came down the steps slowly. When he reached Isaac, he crouched to the boy's level. "You've got 10 seconds to take that back and apologize. You've got a bank account at Merchants Bank in Natchez under your own name. You've sold at least 6 people from this plantation over 2 years and kept the money for yourself. The colonel doesn't know because his accountant is being paid to ignore it. And you killed Margaret when she became a problem." Sarah was pulling Isaac backward now, her face gray with terror. But Isaac kept talking. "I can name the traitors. I can name the dates. I can tell Colonel Bellmont exactly where to look in your office to find the real records you keep separate from the official ones. You hid them in the false bottom of your desk's bottom left drawer." Wexler straightened slowly, his face now showing what everyone recognized as murderous rage barely controlled. But he didn't strike Isaac. He didn't even touch him. Because the child had done something extraordinary. He'd made the accusation in front of witnesses, and he'd been specific enough that the claims could be verified. If Wexler hurt or killed Isaac now, it would look like confirmation. If he sold him immediately, it would look like silencing a witness. The overseer was trapped by the very machinery of plantation management he'd exploited. Everything ran on documentation, on maintaining the appearance of proper procedure. You couldn't just murder or dispose of people without leaving traces that might eventually require explanation. "Take your son back to the house," Wexler said to Sarah, his voice flat and cold. "We'll discuss his behavior with Colonel Bellmont when he returns from Natchez next week." That should have been the end of it. Isaac should have been punished privately, severely, in ways that wouldn't show, but would teach the lesson that enslaved children didn't speak about things they'd witnessed in the main house or the overseer's office. But Isaac had miscalculated one critical element. He'd assumed the truth carried protective power. He'd assumed that once the accusations were made publicly, the system would be forced to investigate. He didn't understand that the system protected itself first, and that everyone who'd heard him speak, including the enslaved witnesses, were now complicit in a narrative that could destroy them all if it reached Colonel Bellmont. Because if Bellmont investigated and found evidence of Wexler's theft, he'd have to acknowledge that his overseer had been embezzling for years, that his accountant had been compromised, that his plantation's reputation would be destroyed by scandal. Powerful men didn't allow such scandals to become public. They buried them, and they buried anyone connected to them. Over the next 7 days, a cascade of quiet conversations spread through Bellmont Plantation and beyond. Sarah begged Isaac to recant, to claim he'd been confused or had misunderstood what he'd seen. Other enslaved people avoided Isaac entirely, afraid of being associated with him. Word reached Natchez through channels no one could quite trace. Servants who heard things in the main house. Traders who passed through and carried gossip. The invisible network of information that connected enslaved communities across county lines. And something else happened. Something that would only make sense later. Thomas Wexler became sick. The illness started small. On August 19th, the day after the confrontation at the gin house, Wexler complained of headaches and nausea during his morning rounds. He attributed it to the heat and continued working, pushing through with the same grim efficiency that characterized everything he did. By evening, he was vomiting into a basin in his cottage, his face pale and sweating despite the August humidity. On August 20th, he couldn't keep food down. The plantation's elderly woman who served as their medical practitioner, a woman named Ruth who'd learned healing from her grandmother and treated everything from fever to broken bones with herbs and prayer, was summoned to Wexler's cottage. She examined him, noted the nausea and stomach cramping, and recommended rest, bland food, and a tea made from ginger root and chamomile. Wexler drank the tea. His condition worsened. By August 21st, he was experiencing severe abdominal pain and diarrhea. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor. His hands trembled. He'd lost weight visibly, his frame already lean now looking gaunt. Colonel Bellmont, who'd returned from Natchez on the 20th, visited Wexler's cottage and found his overseer bedridden, unable to perform his duties. "Should we send for the doctor in Natchez?" Bellmont asked. "It's just a stomach complaint," Wexler said through gritted teeth. "I'll work through it." But he didn't work through it. He got worse. On August 22nd, Wexler developed severe muscle cramps and reported feeling pins and needles in his hands and feet. His urine had turned dark. Ruth visited again, looked at the progression of symptoms, and said something that made everyone present go quiet. "This looks like poison." Colonel Bellmont immediately ordered an investigation. Who'd been near Wexler's cottage? Who'd prepared his food? Who'd had access to his water supply? The spotlight fell immediately on Ruth herself, the healer who'd provided the tea. She was questioned. Her supplies were searched, and her dried herbs were examined for anything toxic. Nothing conclusive was found, though certain herbs could be poisonous in the wrong doses or combinations. But Ruth said something during her questioning that Colonel Bellmont couldn't quite dismiss. Mr. Wexler's been eating meals from the main house kitchen for 7 years without problem. He's been drinking from the plantation, well, same as everyone. The only thing different is that boy named his crimes in front of witnesses. Now Mr. Wexler's dying. Maybe that's not medicine. Maybe that's something else. The curse was taking shape, not from African tradition or conjure work, but from the collective will of people who'd watched a child name evil and wanted desperately to believe naming it was enough. On August 23rd, Thomas Wexler's heart stopped beating at 4:47 in the afternoon. He was 39 years old. The room smelled of vomit and sweat, and something acrid that the witnesses described as sulfur, though no one could explain why. Here's what the official record would eventually show. Thomas Wexler died of acute gastroenteritis, possibly caused by contaminated food or water. A doctor from Natchez arrived 30 hours after the death to examine the body and sign the death certificate. He noted the symptoms: severe gastrointestinal distress, muscle cramping, dark urine, peripheral neuropathy, and concluded that while poison couldn't be ruled out, there was no direct evidence of foul play. Here's what the enslaved community at Bellmont knew. Isaac had named the overseer's crimes, and 18 days later, the overseer was dead. Cause and effect, sin and consequence. The boy had spoken truth into power, and truth had killed the guilty man. The word they used was fix. Isaac had fixed the overseer, not with poison or violence, but with knowledge spoken aloud. The power of naming evil, of stripping away protective secrecy, of making the invisible visible. In their cosmology, this was how justice worked when the legal system failed. Through spiritual mechanics that operated outside white law, but according to laws just as rigid and unavoidable. But there was another mathematics at work, one that wouldn't become clear until much later. Someone had to have actually poisoned Wexler. The symptoms were too specific, too progressive, too consistent with arsenical poisoning to be natural illness. And arsenical compounds were readily available in plantation economies. Rat poison, livestock treatments, chemicals used in processing cotton and wool. Who had access? Practically everyone. The main house kitchen where Wexler's meals were prepared. The well where he drew water. The overseer's office where he kept supplies. His cottage where he slept and ate. The medical supplies Ruth used in her healing work. Arsenical compounds weren't locked away. They were tools of daily operation. Who had motive? Anyone who'd been hurt by Wexler's embezzlement scheme, or who'd lost family to his private sales, which meant potentially 42 people, though most lacked the knowledge or courage to act. Who had opportunity? That was the key question. Wexler's illness had started the day after Isaac's public accusation. The timing suggested that someone had been waiting for a moment of maximum symbolic impact. Someone had understood that if the overseer died immediately after being named as a thief and murderer, the death would look like divine retribution rather than human revenge. What poisons the poisoner? The knowledge that he's been named, the fear that everything he's hidden is coming to light. The investigation Colonel Bellmont ordered was perfunctory. He questioned the main house staff, examined Ruth's supplies, and reviewed Wexler's recent activities. But he didn't look too deeply, because looking deeply would require investigating Isaac's accusations, and investigating those accusations would mean opening the plantation's financial records to scrutiny that might expose not just Wexler's crimes, but Bellmont's own negligence as an absentee owner who'd allowed his overseer to operate unchecked for years. Better to conclude that Wexler died of natural causes. Better to bury the man and move forward. Better to never speak of what Isaac had said at the gin house, because acknowledging those accusations meant acknowledging a 10-year-old enslaved child had exposed a conspiracy that multiple white men, overseer, accountant, traders, even the colonel himself through willful ignorance, had participated in or enabled. So the official story became, Thomas Wexler died of stomach illness. Tragic, unexpected, no evidence of foul play, case closed. But the unofficial story, the one that mattered to the people who'd lived under Wexler's authority, was different. Isaac Brown named the devil, and the devil died. The boy had power. The boy had spoken truth, and truth had teeth. Isaac himself remained quiet through all of this. After his mother dragged him away from the gin house on August 18th, he'd been confined to the quarters, forbidden from entering the main house or going anywhere near the overseer's office. Sarah had locked him in their cabin during the days, terrified that Wexler would find an excuse to punish him severely or sell him south before Colonel Bellmont returned. But Wexler had gotten sick instead, and as the overseer's condition deteriorated, people had started looking at Isaac differently. The fear that had surrounded him after the confrontation began transforming into something else, a wary respect mixed with superstition. Children weren't supposed to have power, but Isaac had demonstrated something that looked very much like power, the ability to name hidden evil and watch it die. On August 24th, the day after Wexler's death, Isaac was summoned to the main house. Colonel Bellmont wanted to speak with him directly, to understand what the child claimed to have seen and how he'd come to make such serious accusations against a trusted overseer. The meeting took place in Bellmont's study, a wood-paneled room lined with books the colonel had inherited, but rarely read. Sarah stood beside Isaac, her hand on his shoulder. Whether to protect him or restrain him, Isaac wasn't certain. "Tell me what you saw," Bellmont said. His voice was careful, neutral, the tone of a man trying to determine whether he was dealing with a precocious child or a serious problem. Isaac repeated everything. The page he'd seen under the supply orders, the pattern of people sold at prices that didn't match the official records, the traders who came through regularly and always dealt directly with Wexler, the bank account in Natchez, Margaret's death and the timing that suggested murder rather than accident. Bellmont listened without interruption. When Isaac finished, the colonel sat back in his chair and studied the child for a long moment. "You understand," Bellmont said finally, "that what you're describing would make Mr. Wexler a thief and a murderer. Those are serious charges. If they're true, they mean I failed to properly supervise my own overseer. If they're false, they mean you're spreading lies that could damage both my reputation and this plantation's standing. So I need to know, did you actually see these things, or did someone put these ideas in your head?" "I saw them, sir. I can show you where he hid the ledgers in his office. His office has already been searched. Nothing suspicious was found. The desk has a false bottom in the lower left drawer. You have to pull the drawer all the way out to access it." This was the moment where everything could have pivoted. Colonel Bellmont could have ordered his people to examine Wexler's desk more carefully. He could have sent someone to Natchez to check whether the overseer maintained a private bank account. He could have questioned the traders who'd done business with Wexler and compared their records to the plantation's official ledgers. But that would require acknowledging that a 10-year-old enslaved child was credible enough to accuse white men of crimes and be taken seriously. It would require disrupting the entire social hierarchy that kept plantation society stable. And most dangerously, it would require Colonel Bellmont to confront the possibility that he'd been complicit through negligence, that he'd spent years in Natchez attending to political ambitions while his overseer robbed him blind. "Go back to the quarters," Bellmont said. "Don't speak of this again. Mr. Wexler is dead. Whatever he may or may not have done, justice has been served." But justice hadn't been served. Or rather, a very specific kind of justice had been served. The kind that operated outside official channels, in the spaces between law and community, where people who had no legal recourse found other means. The symptoms Thomas Wexler experienced between August 19th and August 23rd were consistent with arsenical poisoning: gastrointestinal distress, neurological effects, darkened urine, and eventual cardiovascular collapse. Arsenic was known as inheritance powder in the 19th century because it killed slowly enough to mimic natural illness and was difficult to detect post-mortem without specific chemical tests that most rural doctors didn't perform. Someone had poisoned Thomas Wexler. Someone had started administering small doses beginning August 19th, the day after Isaac's confrontation. Someone had calculated that the overseer's death needed to follow quickly enough after the public accusation to cement the appearance of supernatural consequences, but slowly enough to appear like natural illness. The most obvious suspect was Ruth, the healer who'd provided Wexler with tea during his illness. But Ruth's herbs were examined and found harmless. The tea itself was tested. Someone brewed a pot and forced a dog to drink it. The dog lived. The second obvious suspect was Sarah, Isaac's mother, who worked in the main house kitchen and could have accessed Wexler's food. But Wexler had eaten meals prepared by multiple people during those days, and other people who ate the same food didn't get sick. The third possibility was that multiple people had worked together. A conspiracy of the powerless, coordinating to poison the overseer through multiple vectors so that no single person could be identified as the source. This was the theory Colonel Bellmont found most disturbing because it suggested organized resistance rather than individual malice, a collective decision that an overseer's death was acceptable collateral damage in service of a larger message. But proving conspiracy among enslaved people was nearly impossible. They'd had centuries to perfect the art of collective silence, of protecting each other through shared ignorance that was both genuine and performed. When questioned individually, each person knew nothing, saw nothing, heard nothing. And without confession or physical evidence, the investigation stalled. The fourth and most unsettling possibility was that no one had actually poisoned Wexler. That the symptoms were psychosomatic, stress-induced physical collapse brought on by the exposure of his crimes and the fear of being held accountable. That Isaac's public naming had generated enough anxiety to trigger genuine physiological breakdown, culminating in fatal heart failure or stroke. In this interpretation, the curse was real, not magical, but psychological. The boy had weaponized truth, and truth had killed. The official death certificate signed by Dr. Edmund Marsh of Natchez on August 24, 1856, listed cause of death as gastroenteritis with complications. No mention of poison, no mention of suspicious circumstances. Just another overseer dead from the combination of Mississippi heat, bad food or water, and the general hazards of plantation life. But Dr. Marsh's private journal, found decades later in a trunk of family papers donated to the Adams County Historical Society, told a different story. Entry dated August 24, 1856. Examined body of T. Wexler, overseer. Symptoms consistent with arsenical poisoning, though no definitive test performed. Colonel B. disinclined to pursue investigation. Peculiar atmosphere on the property. The Negroes watching everything but saying nothing. Sense that more occurred here than natural death, but without evidence or cooperation, inquiry futile. Signed certificate as gastroenteritis to spare the colonel embarrassment and avoid investigation that would require interrogating the entire enslaved population. Translation. The doctor knew Wexler had been murdered. Colonel Bellmont knew. Everyone on the plantation knew. But acknowledging murder meant acknowledging motive, and acknowledging motive meant acknowledging Isaac's accusations, and that was a door no one wanted opened. So they buried Thomas Wexler in the plantation cemetery on August 25, 1856. 15 people attended. Colonel Bellmont, 3 white neighbors, the plantation's white overseer candidate who'd be taking over management, and a handful of enslaved people who'd been ordered to dig the grave and fill it afterward. No one spoke fondly of the deceased. No one claimed he'd been a good man or would be missed. They put him in the ground and walked away. The enslaved community held their own ceremony that night, gathering in the clearing beyond the quarters where they conducted religious services, away from white supervision. They sang hymns, they prayed, and they told stories about Isaac Brown, the 10-year-old who'd spoken truth to evil and watched evil die. The stories took on their own life. Some said Isaac had conjured power from his grandmother, who'd been brought from Africa and knew the old ways. Some said he'd been blessed by God with the gift of sight, able to see men's souls and call out their sins. Some said he was a prophet, sent to remind people that judgment was always coming for the wicked, even when human law failed. Isaac himself said nothing. He'd learned the lesson that speaking truth was dangerous, even when truth proved fatal to the guilty. He'd exposed Thomas Wexler's crimes and watched the overseer die. But he'd also seen that the system protected itself by absorbing the scandal and moving forward as if nothing had changed. Wexler was gone, but slavery remained. The power structure remained. The violence remained. When truth kills but changes nothing, was justice served or merely performed? Colonel Bellmont never investigated Isaac's accusations. He hired a new overseer, tightened his financial oversight, and spent more time on the plantation to ensure he wasn't robbed again. He never acknowledged that Wexler had been stealing from him for years, never prosecuted the accountant who'd enabled the scheme, never sought restitution from the traders who'd participated. And he never punished Isaac, because punishing Isaac would require explaining why the child had needed punishing, and that explanation would require admitting the accusations had been true. Isaac Brown lived another 63 years. When the Civil War came to Mississippi in 1861, he was 15 years old enough to understand that the conflict represented everything he'd witnessed compressed into national crisis. The system that had allowed Thomas Wexler to trade human beings for personal profit was the same system that had brought armies to Mississippi soil, that had made slavery such a profitable institution that powerful men were willing to destroy the country rather than surrender it. He stayed at Bellmont Plantation through the war years, watching the Confederacy bleed itself white for the preservation of an economy built on stolen labor. When federal troops arrived in Adams County in 1863, bringing chaotic emancipation and military occupation. Isaac was 17. When the war ended in 1865, he was 19 and legally free for the first time in his life. He moved to Natchez in 1866, found work as a carpenter's apprentice, and built a quiet life that had nothing to do with plantations or overseers or the memory of standing in August sun and naming a white man's crimes in front of witnesses who'd believed speaking would get him killed. But the story followed him. In the black community of Natchez, people knew about the boy who'd cursed the overseer. The story got retold at church gatherings, at funerals, at celebrations. The details mutated with each retelling. Sometimes Isaac was 7 years old, sometimes 15. Sometimes Wexler died instantly after the confrontation. Sometimes he lingered for months. Sometimes the curse involved rituals and conjure bags. Sometimes it was pure spoken word made manifest. Isaac never corrected these stories. He understood they served a purpose larger than historical accuracy. They gave people hope that evil could be defeated, that the powerless weren't completely without weapons. That truth spoken boldly carried consequences, even in a world structured to silence certain voices. He married in 1871, had 6 children, and worked as a master carpenter in Natchez until his death in 1919 at the age of 73. His obituary in the Natchez Democrat made no mention of Thomas Wexler or Bellmont Plantation or the confrontation at the gin house. It simply noted that Isaac Brown had been a skilled craftsman, a church deacon, and a father who'd lived to see 5 of his 6 children reach adulthood, itself a remarkable achievement for a man born enslaved in 1846. But among his family, the story persisted. Isaac's grandchildren knew it. His great-grandchildren knew it. And they knew the lesson Isaac had tried to teach them, that naming evil mattered even when it didn't immediately change the system. That speaking truth was an act of resistance, even when the truth-teller paid a price. That 10-year-old children could shame grown men if they were brave enough and precise enough in their accusations. What they didn't know, what Isaac never told them, was whether he'd actually believed Wexler would die from being named, whether he'd understood the accusation would set other events in motion, whether he'd known that someone would poison the overseer and make the curse appear real, or whether he'd simply been a child who'd seen injustice and spoken about it without calculating the consequences, and everything that followed had been luck, community conspiracy, or genuine supernatural intervention. Isaac took that knowledge to his grave. The Bellmont plantation site is now empty bottomland. The main house burned in a fire during Reconstruction and never rebuilt. The quarters are gone. The cotton gin collapsed decades ago. Only the plantation cemetery remains, a 1/4 acre of weathered headstones behind a rusted fence, slowly being reclaimed by kudzu and honeysuckle. Thomas Wexler's grave marker is still there, a simple stone reading T. Wexler, 1817-1856. Locals say it's the most frequently vandalized grave in Adams County. Overturned, spray-painted, occasionally dug up by treasure hunters who believed the overseer's stolen money was buried with him. The county stops replacing the marker in 1993 after the 4th one gets destroyed. But the story lives on. Historians debate whether Isaac Brown actually existed or whether he's a folkloric composite of multiple resistance narratives. Church deacons in Natchez tell the tale to young people as a lesson about speaking truth to power. Genealogists researching Adams County history find references to the incident in letters and journals, always oblique, always incomplete, as if the writers couldn't quite bring themselves to document what everyone knew had happened. And sometimes, on August nights when the air hangs thick with humidity and the smell of growing cotton, people swear they can hear a child's voice near the old gin house site, speaking quietly but clearly, naming crimes that were never officially acknowledged, demanding accountability that was never officially rendered. Truth spoken loudly enough leaves echoes that last longer than stone. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.